Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight for this very unique opportunity to hear straight from the officials who were involved in the discussions surrounding the Iran deal and plan, about those discussions, and an opportunity to ask questions about a very significant part of our foreign policy and diplomacy efforts at the moment. I'm Jocelyn Benson. I'm the Dean of the Law School and want to welcome all of you here this evening. I want to begin by welcoming our President and First Lady, Dr. Wilson and Jacqueline Wilson, who've joined us this evening. And I'm going to ask the President to say a few words as well. President Wilson has been really an extraordinary leader for us here at the university. He began his term as our 12th president in 2013, August 1st, so he just completed his 2-year anniversary of becoming president. And prior to joining Wayne State, President Wilson served as the Deputy Director for Strategic Scientific Planning and Program Coordination at the National Institute on Minority Health and Health Disparities of the National Institutes of Health. He was also Dean of the School of Medicine and Vice President for Health Sciences at Creighton University, President of Texas Tech University Health Sciences Center, and concurrently Chancellor of the University of Colorado, Denver, and Chair of the Board of Directors of the University of Colorado Hospital. He holds an undergraduate degree from Allegheny College and a Master of Science degree in epidemiology from UCLA and a medical degree from Harvard. And I've said often how proud I am to be leading the law school under his leadership. So I would like President Wilson, if you're able to say a few words to welcome us. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Jocelyn. I wasn't expecting an introduction. It certainly wasn't necessary. I think that Gary Pollard, Chair of the Board, is going to be here. I'm sorry he's not here yet, but I think he may be joining us. I do want to also just add my welcome to everybody for being here. I think this is a unique opportunity, as was mentioned. You know, it's important to have a much better understanding of the Iran nuclear deal. A lot of people have different opinions about it, and very strong opinions. But as I've talked to several people, oftentimes these opinions are not really formed on a deep understanding of the issues, but on other factors. And so to be able to really understand what the real issues are is going to be very, very important. And what better place to do that than in a university setting? And we're very proud that this is part of the Wayne Law's International Legal Studies program. This program has just an incredible array of resources to really focus on international studies. And certainly our students benefit from this, but it's also not our students. It's also a great community resource, particularly in a city like Detroit that depends so much on its revitalization of its economic efforts on international trade and international relations. So it's, with that in mind, I'm very happy to see so many members of the community who are also present today. And so with that, I wanted to keep my comments very short because I think the main event is really going to be worthwhile, and we should save as much time as possible for the main event. So welcome, everybody. I hope you have a great discussion and that you enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you, President Wilson. It's great to have you here with us tonight. And I now want to recognize Professor Greg Fox, who's going to be moderating and leading our event tonight. Professor Gregory Fox, of course, is the director of our program on international legal studies, which is one of our 4 pinnacle programs here at the law school. And it speaks very highly of the program, of course, that our first event of the semester has been brought to us under his leadership and with these esteemed panelists. Professor Fox is an international authority on international law and international organizations and a leader of a variety of academic and professional organizations. He's been a part of the Wayne Law faculty since 2002, but he began his legal career in the litigation department of Hale & Dorr in Boston and has been the recipient of several prestigious awards, grants, and other opportunities in the years since. And under Professor Fox's leadership, our international law program has really grown in part because of the continuous high caliber programming that we see come out of that program. So for those of you who have just begun your time here at Wayne Law, I see many new students here tonight, consider this your introduction to the great program that Professor Fox is running through PILS, the Program in International Legal Studies. And I also, of course, want to recognize Professor Chip Brower, who's joined us tonight as well, who's also one of our esteemed international law professors, and Professor Brad Roth, another member of our very esteemed international law faculty. And thank you to our other members of our faculty who have joined us as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Fox. I'm looking forward to a great discussion about a very timely and important issue. So thank you to our panelists for coming here tonight to talk with us about this issue, and thank you, Professor Fox, for making this event happen.
Thanks very much, Dean Benson and President Wilson. I'd also like to extend thanks to a small group of students from the Wayne International Law Students Association who on very short notice gave us an enormous amount of help in setting up this event. They worked tirelessly with all our events, and I'm very grateful for their assistance. Well, as Jocelyn mentioned, I am the director of the Program for International Legal Studies here at the law school, and this is just an extraordinary topic to begin our speaker series for the year. Each year we bring in speakers who are academics or policymakers or advocates of various kinds to talk about international law issues that are at the forefront of the news, and I think you couldn't find a more timely topic than the Iran nuclear deal. Since everyone is here, I can maybe just quickly mention two other speakers that we're going to have this semester. One is Anna Melamud from the Office of Legal Advisor to the State Department, who will be coming to talk about normalization of relations, U.S. relations with Cuba. And then Elliot Duringer from the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions to talk about the climate summit in Paris in December, which will attempt to craft a new agreement on climate change and global warming. We don't have definite dates for those events, but if there's a sign-in sheet on the table outside, if you'd like to receive emails about those and other programming, I very much encourage you to sign up there. Let me make two housekeeping notes before I introduce our speakers. The first is that the event in a lot of places was advertised as ending at 7. Because we realized there was going to be a large turnout and people are eager to have their questions answered, we've extended the ending time to 7:30. If that interferes with any plans that you have made, feel free to leave. I apologize for that switch, but we wanted to have as full a discussion as possible. The second thing is that you may have picked up note cards when you walked in. We're asking people to write down questions, which will come to me, and then I will read all of them if there are enough, if there's enough time, or a representative sampling if there isn't. But if there is anybody who didn't have an opportunity to write down a question and would like to do so, please go ahead, and I would ask you to pass it to the outside of the rows, and one of our student volunteers will collect the questions. So with those preliminaries, let me introduce our two speakers. The first speaker is Matt Nosenchuk, who is White House liaison to the American Jewish community, working in the White House Office of Public Engagement. Matt joined the Obama administration in 2009 as a senior counselor to Assistant Attorney General Tom Perez in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, where he oversaw the Justice Department's implementation of the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act. In 2012, he became the Associate General Counsel for Legal Counsel at the Department of Homeland Security. Prior to that, Matt worked in the private, public, and nonprofit sectors, including in the Clinton Justice Department's Office of Policy Development, on the House Judiciary Committee minority staff, and as counsel for Senator Bill Nelson of Florida. Matt is almost a native Michigander. I understand he moved here when he was quite young and grew up in southeast Michigan, went to the Cranbrook School, but then decamped for the West Coast, where he earned a bachelor's degree and law degree from Stanford University. Paul Irwin, our second speaker, is Director for Nonproliferation at the National Security Council in the White House, which is a position he has held since November 2013. Paul was a member of the team that negotiated the deal that we are going to be talking about, as well as the team that negotiated the joint prior temporary agreement. Before coming to the NSC, Paul held numerous national security positions since joining the Department of Energy in 1999. Paul holds a BA from the University of Pennsylvania and an MA in International Policy Studies with a certificate in nonproliferation from the Monterey Institute for International Studies. So with all of those preliminaries out of the way, I'm very happy to introduce Matt Nosenchuk and then Paul Irwin.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Professor Fox. Thank you, President Wilson, Dean Benson. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'll just take issue with what you said. I'm not almost a native Michigander. I am a native Michigander. I was born in Windsor, which is otherwise known by the Journey song South Detroit, but moved to Lafayette Park when I was in elementary school. During that time, my mother received her master's degree from the School of Psychology here at Wayne State University, and then was affiliated with the Medical Center as a psychologist. So my Detroit roots run deep. I wear a Shinola watch, which I love. I'm a Tigers fan, a Lions fan, a Michigan fan. So it's great to be back here and to be home. If you had told me, though, that I'd be coming back to talk about the Iran nuclear deal like a few years ago, I would have said, what are you talking about? But here we are, and here I am. And actually, my first job, I have to say this, when I was still in high school, was as an intern for Senator Carl Levin, who I know now is associated with the Wayne Law School, as an incredible public servant and human being and a role model for me and so many others, and a strong supporter of the Iran nuclear deal as well. And I did talk to him briefly for this event, and I think was sorry he couldn't be here tonight. But he's been an important voice among many voices who have been supportive of this agreement. So let me step back and give you the context of my role and sort of the broad overview of where we are, and then Paul will talk about the details of the agreement, and then we really want to turn to your questions and hear your questions about any aspects of the deal or the congressional process that's taking place right now. So I would be remiss if I didn't open by saying, today is actually a very important day in what is a 60-day congressional review period. We are on day 45 of that congressional review period. This was a review period that was agreed to by the administration and Congress after the Lausanne framework was agreed to. It was created to enable a process whereby Congress would have the chance to review what is an executive agreement. So it's not a treaty. It's not an instrument that requires two-thirds approval by the Senate. So we agreed to this process whereby they would have this opportunity to review the details of the agreement and then decide whether to approve it or disapprove it. So when the deal was announced on the 14th of July, it was transmitted to the Congress a few days later, which started this 60-day clock. During that time, a resolution of disapproval was introduced, and the threshold numbers that were key for us are 34 and 41. 34 being the number of senators who would be required to sustain a veto by the president of a resolution of disapproval should such a resolution pass. And today, Senator Barbara Mikulski of Maryland announced her support for the deal, making her the 34th senator to come out in support of the deal, and thereby providing us with the margin we need to prevent override of a veto by the president if it comes to that. The other number that's important is 41. This threshold that we passed today is not something that we are, we are stopping our work. We are working overtime to persuade each and every member of the Congress who remains undecided of the merits of this deal on the facts in the hope that they will come out and support it. And if 41 senators should come out and support, then we have a margin that would be sufficient to prevent a resolution from coming to the floor of the Senate. We don't know whether we'll get there, but we are certainly not taking our pedal off the gas at all and working to really persuade Congress and the American people of the merits of this deal. People say that there should be a better deal, but this is the better deal. This is a deal that was the result of several years, 2 years of arduous negotiations. Paul made 37 trips, I believe, to Europe to participate in the negotiations. And since the interim agreement was announced in December of 2013, I've been spending a huge amount of my time working on public engagement as the liaison of the Jewish community on this issue, because the Jewish community is a community that is very concerned about the deal due to the fact that they are concerned about Israel's security, which is an issue that we're also very concerned about, and believe that this deal protects and will further Israel's security. But this deal, just to sort of step back, I want folks to understand that this Iran nuclear deal is not something that came up in the last few months as a political opportunity for the president to score points on a foreign policy issue. This is something that he has been committed to throughout his presidency and before. When he was in the Senate, he worked on a bipartisan basis with Senator Richard Lugar of Indiana, who also is as a former member, is supportive of the deal, on nonproliferation issues. As a candidate and as president, he talked about addressing the Iran nuclear threat. He supported the institution of the sanctions, which were implemented precisely in order to get the Iranians to come to the table to negotiate with the United States and the other world powers in the P5+1 to reach a comprehensive agreement. He has been focused on this issue then for the entirety of his presidency, and as Paul will discuss when he talks a little bit more about the dynamics of the negotiations, in the last 2 years we were in a position where we felt we had negotiating partners with the Iranians that would enable us to achieve our objectives, the principal objective being preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And this agreement does that. Iran has made a permanent commitment not to have a nuclear weapon, and we have instituted through this agreement a framework for intense intrusive monitoring and inspections. Iran will get sanctions relief when it implements its obligations under the agreement. And Paul will talk more about that framework and what the bargain is that's at the heart of this deal. But this is something that the President has been deeply committed to and involved in, both throughout the negotiations and since the announcement of the deal. I can't overemphasize the extent to which he has been personally involved in advocating for this deal. He knows the deal inside and out, and is firmly of the belief that by talking about the facts, by telling people what's in the deal, explaining what's in it, what's not, disputing and setting the record straight on all the red herrings that are being put forward, that on the facts we have a strong argument because we have a good deal. And he is firmly committed to engaging with supporters and opponents of the deal alike in the effort to persuade them that this is a good deal that should be supported. And therefore all of us who work under him are engaged in that effort as well. It is not only a reflection of his commitment to nonproliferation and to preventing a regional power in the Middle East from obtaining a nuclear weapon, given its potential to cause trouble in the region, and the fact that it has done that. We believe that removing the Iranian nuclear threat represents a significant step forward towards furthering regional stability, towards removing the specter of a nuclear-armed Iran from the region that, would potentially threaten Israel and our other allies. And it also is a reflection of a broader commitment on the part of this president to turn a corner on foreign policy, and rather than resorting to, in the first instance, to unilateral military action, as happened in the Iran war or in the Iraq war, or basically unilateral. It's building a multilateral consensus to further our foreign policy objectives, to uphold global and regional security through diplomacy, to give diplomacy the opportunity to work. And one of the key facts about this deal is the diplomacy provides a framework that will prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. It's not based on trust, it's based on verification, it's based on monitoring, and we're not giving up any options down the road should we need to contemplate or resort to them. All options remaining on the table, but this deal at this time represents the best opportunity to address the Iran nuclear threat in a comprehensive way with support from the global community and with the maximum leverage that we've obtained through the sanctions that have been opposed. There's, throughout this debate, been a lot of criticism, but no credible alternatives to this deal have been put forward. So the bottom line is this is a good deal, this is the better deal, and Paul, who, as Greg said, was intimately involved in the negotiations, will tell you why that is. Paul?
Matt just laid out kind of where we are. Let me take a step back and tell you how we got here. So in 2002, Iran got caught with nuclear facilities that it shouldn't have had. I'm sorry, make sure you can hear me. In 2002, Iran got caught with nuclear facilities that it shouldn't have. It didn't declare that it was developing a large enrichment facility called Natanz. It didn't declare that it was building a heavy water production plant to support a reactor right across the street, as it should have. And that essentially kicked off the following 13 years of negotiations between Iran and elements of the international community, which culminated in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in July. But in the interim, there were a number of failed attempts at negotiation where P5+1 parties, or the European three, the Brits, the Germans, the French, would try to work it out with Iran. All the while, Iran was lying to the IAEA, saying that it didn't have a lot of the facilities that it was subsequently forced to come out with, and not admitting to a weapons program that it had pursued probably up until the fall of 2003. And so the context for this deal is that this has been a long time coming, and a long time in which negotiations have not yielded results, and Iran's program has progressed further. So the key to how these negotiations really started goes to what happened in November 2013, which was secret negotiations between the U.S. and Iran, which obviously later came to light, allowed for the Joint Plan of Action, the interim deal, that essentially said, okay, we're going to freeze in place Iran's program, which had been continually advancing over the previous 9 years or so. And we're going to allow for a long-term solution to see if we can really once and for all handle this. And that's what we then spent the last 20 months or so trying to hammer out. Well, in November 2013, we were obviously very excited that we had finally gotten an interim deal that halted the program, that rolled it back in a few key ways. But we also sat down and in the White House Situation Room had a series of meetings to say, well, what are we really trying to get out of this? What is it that is the comprehensive deal that we're looking for? Because clearly, Iran's program has progressed far past where it was in 2002 because they just kept moving forward. And what is it that are our fundamental objectives? And at that point, before we started the negotiations, we laid out 4 clear objectives. And you will probably have heard of these in the press referred to as the 4 pathways to fissile material. Fissile material being either highly enriched uranium or plutonium, the center of the nuclear weapon, the thing that you need in order for a nuclear weapon to work. And so what we said was we want to shut down Iran's ability to produce either highly enriched uranium or plutonium, because without those things, it can't get a bomb. And so what we tried to do from the beginning of the negotiations was address Iran's ability to use the infrastructure that had already built up at Natanz, that place that was outed in 2002, at Fordow, which is an underground enrichment facility under a mountain, small, clandestine until it was outed by the West, by the Arak reactor, which is currently slated to produce 1 to 2 weapons worth of weapons-grade plutonium, and by the covert path, if Iran chose to use facilities that have not been declared to the International Atomic Energy Agency. So we sat down and said, well, what exactly are we trying to do? And the answer was, we're going to prevent Iran from having a nuclear weapon, first and foremost by shutting down those pathways. For the next 18 months, we engaged with our P5+1 colleagues, so the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council, Germany, with the European Union, with the IAEA, and with other interested parties in the region to figure out exactly how that would work. We thought we could do it in 6 months. At least that was the goal. That was what we aspired to. Much to our chagrin, the challenges were wider than we could get across in 6 months, because the Iranians came to the table and said, okay, well, we currently have 19,000 centrifuges. These are the devices you use to enrich uranium. And these are the centrifuges that are at the enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordow. And they said, well, what we agreed to here is that we would have a limited program, but by a limited program, we don't actually mean bringing down the number of centrifuges. We mean that you can monitor them as they grow to 190,000 centrifuges. And that we're going to do that in the space of 7 years. So we had something of a disconnect in expectations, shall we say. They came to the negotiations essentially arguing that they were being treated unfairly, that they were being called out, and that all of the allegations levied against them by the West were just not true. This made for interesting negotiations, as we had a number of rounds where essentially we were talking past each other. And the real technical grit of this was not, we didn't engage on that until a little bit later. What we quickly came to, though, was that what we needed to secure the objectives that we had laid out wasn't one thing. It wasn't going to Iran and saying, you have to do this or no deal. We found that through creativity and tenacity, we could find a solution that worked for us, even if it wasn't our first choice. And in so doing, allowed Iran the space, in many of these cases, on a variety of different technical solutions, to save face. And so the bottom line in the deal is that we were able to secure the 4 pathways, and I'll talk about each of them in a minute, in a very comprehensive way. But we did it in a way that Iran gets to say, yeah, no, we still have that reactor. Okay, it's not the same design. Yes, we still have that facility. Okay, it's being converted to a research center and it's not going to be enriching uranium, but it still exists. And so as we walked through the negotiations, what we found to be most effective was coming up with creative solutions, working with the Iranians, and often what we found was our solution didn't work, but then their solution, with a few tweaks, could be made to work. And so where we succeeded the most, I would say, from a macro standpoint, was working toward the goal and being less concerned about the specific route that we were going to take. And then, as I said, tenacity. Okay, let's go through the 4 pathways here to really lay out what's in the deal and why this is such a good deal. You probably have heard referred to breakout timelines. What this means is the amount of time that it would take Iran, if it chose to dash for a nuclear weapon, to enrich enough uranium to have a weapon's worth of highly enriched uranium, just 1 weapon's worth. And currently, that time, because of the progress Iran has made in its enrichment program, is 2 to 3 months. And that is because they have a fairly large number of centrifuges and a very large amount of low-enriched uranium. So highly enriched uranium is what's used for a weapon. Low-enriched uranium is what you use for reactors. They have about 12,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. So our first foray into this to try and get the breakout timeline extended was to vastly restrict the number of centrifuges that Iran could have. And as I said, they didn't want to bring down the centrifuges to 1,000 or 2,000. They wanted to expand to 190,000. And so what we did instead was we said, okay, I understand that centrifuges are something of a symbol in Iran, because the negotiators were very clear with us, and they said, look, you can't take away the centrifuges. We simply can't have fewer centrifuges today than when we started, or I'm sorry, tomorrow than when we started. And so we said, well, okay, there are different ways at getting at this breakout timeline thing. Let's talk about all of them. And one of the things that we got out of this deal was a commitment by Iran to either ship out of country or dilute 98% of this stockpile, this 12,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium. The net effect of that was that they could keep somewhat more centrifuges than we would otherwise let them have. We also restricted them to only working with the first-generation centrifuges, which are essentially 1970s technology. They wouldn't be able to enrich uranium for 10 years with advanced centrifuges, which are under development right now in Iran. We also made sure that the way the centrifuges are piped would stay constant so that they couldn't repipe them in a way that would make it more easy for weapons design. The point is that we went in trying to find a solution at the end of the day, not necessarily mated to the first one we went to. But still, the breakout timelines didn't work, because even restricting to that small amount of enriched uranium, 300 kilograms down from 12,000, we couldn't let them keep all the centrifuges that are currently operational, which is about 9,000 or so. And so ultimately, Iran had to cave further, and that's how we end up with 5,000 operating centrifuges, 300 kilograms for 10 years. And so we're able to satisfy the president's guidance for a one-year breakout timeline, at least a one-year breakout timeline for 10 years, despite Iran today having a pretty large enrichment capacity at the Natanz facility. So that was the first major hurdle that we were able to come across. The second was this deeply buried facility, the Fordow facility, which is very small if you're looking to enrich uranium for a power reactor, but coincidentally pretty well sized if you're looking to make one bomb's worth of nuclear material. You actually need fewer centrifuges to make material for a weapon than you do for a reactor. So underground, Iran made a facility that was about 3,000 centrifuges. And they said, there's no way we're getting rid of this. We have to have it. Because, well, what happens if you bomb Natanz? We need this as an insurance policy because we know you can't bomb this mountain site. And we said, there's absolutely no way. You can keep a facility that you built covertly in blatant violation of UN Security Council resolutions, and that allows you to essentially have a bomb's worth of highly enriched uranium in a pretty short amount of time. So the solution that we found was the conversion of the facility. So they have to rip out 2/3 of the infrastructure that's there. And currently there are 16 cascades of centrifuges. Cascades are groupings. You put a number of centrifuges in a row, and the gas literally cascades from one to the other to the other. They have 16 at Fordow. At the end of the implementation of this agreement, they will only have 4 cascades, and they're not going to do anything. They're just going to sit there. The rest of that facility has to be transitioned into a research center with international presence that Iran can use for a variety of purposes, to include things like astrophysics and neutrino research and other things that they essentially could say, well, look, it's still a nuclear facility and it still exists, because then they didn't have to give up the facility. But from our perspective, the way that we were able to achieve the president's objective was, that's a facility that's not going to process uranium. It's not going to allow to have anything in the facility, any enriched uranium or natural uranium, for 15 years. It physically can't do the job it was intended to do. And so we essentially shut down that path as well. We also enlisted the help of the Russians, who are now going to reconfigure some of the actual centrifuges that were in that facility and have them, instead of enriching uranium, they're going to be used to produce stable isotopes for medical research. And so, again, we were trying to think creatively about what we could do at these sites, because Iran was resistant to our saying it just has to be shut down. They also, in the vein of saving face, didn't really like the idea of let's just make it into a radioactive waste site, or let's use it as a storage facility, or something like that. And so, again, what I'm trying to give you a flavor for is not just what's in the deal, but how we got to there. The third pathway that we shut down was the plutonium pathway. And here, Iran has almost completed a heavy water research reactor called Arak, A-R-A-K. As I said, that reactor, if it were to come online, would produce 1 to 2 weapons worth of weapons-grade plutonium every year that it operates. So when people talk about walking away from the deal, we have to remember that what we're walking into is not what we've had for the last 18 to 20 months where we've gotten the program frozen because of that interim deal. We're walking into a world where Iran continues to try to make progress on that reactor, and it could come online relatively quickly. We're walking into a world where Iran could put a lot more centrifuges into its facilities, and that breakout timeline could go underneath the 2 to 3 months it is now. But at the reactor, what we were able to get Iran to agree to was it has to pull out the center of the reactor, the core that is where all of the nuclear reaction happens. And it's going to pull it out, it's going to put it to the side, and again, Iran didn't want to ship it out, and it didn't want to destroy it, so we said, okay, well, instead of destroying it, it'll physically still be there, how about you fill it with concrete, which will effectively be the same thing. So Iran is going to render unusable permanently this reactor core, which is designed specifically to be able to produce plutonium for weapons, or rather that is the practical effect of the design. And in its place, we have agreed to help Iran with a design that's not going to produce any weapons-grade plutonium. Instead, that reactor will be used for medical research and for other non-weapons nuclear applications. So you're seeing the trend here, right? We're trying to work with the obstinate Iranian position, we cannot make any changes, and then we find ways that we are able to satisfy the objectives. And so with that, the immediate threat of the plutonium pathway was shut down. But we didn't stop there. We also said, for the lifetime of the Arak reactor, Iran has to ship out the spent fuel. The fresh fuel goes into the reactor turns on, spent fuel comes out, and it's in that spent fuel that plutonium is found. Plutonium doesn't exist in nature, it's made in reactors. And so we said, all right, well, even though we don't think that you're going to be able to have plutonium that's weapons usable in this fuel, we're going to insist that all of it be shipped out of the country for the lifetime of that reactor, and they agreed. Further still, we said that you can't produce a facility to get the plutonium out of that spent fuel, a reprocessing facility that would separate out the radioactive elements beyond plutonium that inherently are part of spent fuel. And so one of the central tenets to shutting down the plutonium pathway was securing an Iranian agreement not to reprocess or conduct research into reprocessing for 15 years. There again, shutting that down. The most significant pathway where we made real inroads was shutting down the covert pathway. And this is the four big pathways. Iran has progressed to the point, particularly on the enrichment program, that if it wanted to have a covert enrichment facility, it could. It could take technology that it's developed, centrifuge technology that it's developed on the declared side, and go someplace else, and it'd be very hard to find a centrifuge facility based on just the access that the IAEA has today. So the IAEA, International Atomic Energy Agency, is tasked with monitoring Iran's declared facilities to make sure that they're not misused to produce weapons-grade uranium, for instance, and to make sure that material at those facilities isn't diverted someplace else. But there are real limitations today to what the IAEA can do in Iran. And that's because the majority of the transparency and verification measures goes to the declared program. And the IAEA, before this deal, didn't really have an ability to look for the undeclared activities, which is clearly one of the things that we would have to worry about if Iran were attempting to build a nuclear weapon. The main vehicle that the IAEA uses to get at that problem in other countries around the world is the additional protocol. It was created after we realized after the first Gulf War that the IAEA didn't have the tools it needed to detect the Iraqi nuclear program. And the additional protocol is essentially the norm among non-proliferation treaty abiding states. But Iran hasn't agreed to abide by it. And so now with this deal, Iran is going to provisionally apply the additional protocol, which means from a legal standpoint that it is going to be committed forever to the provisions in the additional protocol. And what the additional protocol says is that Iran has to not just tell the IAEA about declared facilities. It has to provide a lot more information about those facilities and processes that are linked to the declared facilities. So it extends the circle to get at information about, well, where the centrifuges come from. Well, where did the uranium come from? Where is it that other aspects of the program are, so that we have more insight to make sure that those things are not out furnishing a covert program someplace over there. Beyond that, what the additional protocol does is it allows the IAEA to ask for access anywhere in the country that it wants to go. So if it gets information from another member state or from its own information that Iran has a covert enrichment facility in Gazvin, some other part of Iran, it can request access to that site. And the additional protocol has had a lot of success in preventing other countries from attempting to go to the covert path for nuclear weapons. So the additional protocol was kind of the base for Iran, for what we thought would be acceptable from the covert path. But it wasn't enough. And the reason is that Iran has cheated and has lied for over a decade. And this deal was not about trusting and verifying. This deal was distrust and verify. And we really wanted to augment what is the norm for international cooperation with the IAEA with a series of steps that would make it even harder for Iran to cheat. And we did that for two reasons. First, because we thought that the more we could pile on top, the more likely it would be that we or our partners would detect that Iran was up to no good and was actually pursuing a covert pathway. But the second reason, and probably more important, is the deterrent value. We reasoned that the harder we made it for Iran, the more barriers we put in front of it, the less likely it would be that Iran would choose to attempt to go the covert path, because they would think that it would be very difficult to get away with making nuclear material for a weapon. And so what we did was augment the additional protocol with four things. First, no country in the world is required by the IAEA to say where, or to allow for continuous monitoring of uranium supplies. So it has to declare. The IAEA can then go to a uranium mine every so often and say, yep, okay, here's your uranium mine. But if the IAEA visits on a Tuesday, what's to say that material from that mine on a Thursday isn't going over to a covert program? So it's an inherent weakness in the way the IAEA does business with all countries in the world. And again, Iran's not all countries, so we said, we want you to agree that you're going to allow the IAEA to continuously monitor the production of uranium in country. So at every place where Iran takes uranium out of the ground and processes it into yellowcake, which you probably heard, remember from the Iraq War, yellowcake, that's the intermediate step between the rock that comes out of the ground and the gas that spins in centrifuges. And so we said, okay, any place you make yellowcake, you have to have a continuous IAEA presence with cameras, seals, tags, and so forth, so that we know that you're not diverting that material. And they agreed. So for the next 25 years, Iran has to allow the IAEA to monitor every place in the country where it could make uranium. And again, logically, what we're doing is we're cutting off the source material to a covert path. So then, in addition to having a covert enrichment facility to make enough material for a weapon, Iran would then need a covert uranium mine, a covert uranium mill, a covert uranium conversion facility, a covert uranium enrichment facility to get up to highly enriched uranium for a weapon, another conversion facility to take that material, once it's been enriched to the appropriate level, to make into uranium metal for the actual weapon, and then all of the actual weapons work. This is all activities that Iran would have to do and get away with, and believe it could get away with, in order to actually make the decision to go and try to make a nuclear weapon in the first place. So that was number one, was uranium mills. The second thing we did, we said, well, okay, let's try to get at that problem that Iran has a certain number of places where it makes centrifuges to feed into the declared facilities. Well, again, how do we know that Iran isn't going to use those sites to siphon off centrifuges and furnish an undeclared location? So under the deal, Iran for the next 20 years has to allow IAEA inspectors to monitor the equipment that is used to make centrifuges. It has to allow the IAEA to track, number, each and every one of the centrifuges that exist in Iran today and will exist for the next 20 years. So that now, in addition to all those facilities I just mentioned that Iran has to make and get away with, it also has to build an entirely separate, covert centrifuge component manufacturing infrastructure. So then it has to build these places, it has to furnish those places, it has to man those places, it has to run those places, all for a long enough period of time without detection so that it can have material for a weapon. So those are two of them. The third one was we said that Iran, if it wanted to buy things from overseas, would need to go through what we're calling a procurement channel. Essentially, it was going to tell us if anything it needed for its nuclear program that hit a certain mark on the what's called the Nuclear Suppliers Group trigger list or dual use annex. But it's a set of items and materials that if it wants to buy them for the nuclear program, it has to get approval from us and it has to tell us it's doing it. If we ever see through intelligence channels that Iran is importing one of these pieces of equipment or one of these items outside of that channel, it can be an immediate tip-off that Iran is trying to furnish a covert facility. So Iran liked the idea of the procurement channel because currently it's not allowed to buy anything for the nuclear program because the nuclear program is sanctioned under UN Security Council resolution. We liked it because it was a very good transparency measure and something that no one else in the world has to do. So that's three. The fourth one, and this is kind of wrapping up whole four pathways speech here, but we got back to the States, and I was kind of flabbergasted at the extent to which the provision that mandates that the IEA get access to suspect sites is no more than 24 days. And I was flabbergasted that that provision has been spun into a negative. Now, let me explain this for a second. Under the additional protocol, I think I mentioned before that the IEA has the right to ask for access. It doesn't have the right to actually get the access. Under the additional protocol, for suspect sites, what the IEA can do is it can provide notice 24 hours ahead of time that it wants to go to someplace. In some cases, the country says, fine, come on in, no problem. But in other cases, and particularly when it comes to Iran, that has not been the case. There are at least three specific instances where Iran has simply delayed and delayed while it has tried to hide evidence of work that it shouldn't have been doing until it thinks that the coast is clear, there's no evidence of nuclear material, and then it'll let the IAEA in. So two instances it's already happened. The third comes to a facility called Parchin, which you probably have heard about in the press. We can get to in a minute too. What we were able to negotiate is revolutionary. Now, when the IAEA asks to go someplace, there's a bookend to the process. Now, Iran can't simply go on and on and on and stall for weeks, months, literally years on end, which is what it's done in the past. This is something the IAEA doesn't do anywhere else in the country, or anywhere else in the world. And it's something that Iran was initially incredibly resistant to. And personally, I didn't think that we could have a deal unless Iran would agree to this, and I didn't think they were going to agree to it. So this is a fantastic thing that allows the IAEA the ability to actually get assured access, or all the sanctions can snap back. And as a result, the deterrent value alone is monumental for us. And Iran has agreed to this provision for the next 15 years. Now, a lot has been said in the press about, well, 24 days is simply too long. And I agree, 24 days is too long for certain of the things that Iran would need to do to build a nuclear weapon. But those are the things that don't include nuclear material, right? So 24 days is too long if the IAEA is trying to catch Iran red-handed at doing computer modeling for a nuclear weapon. Agreed. But then again, so is 24 hours. Frankly, 24 minutes. You know, if you wanted to delete evidence or throw the computer out the window. So we never said that this 24-day thing was to cover every transgression. But what we did say was that the 24 days would be sufficient for us to be able to detect, for the IAEA to be able to detect evidence of nuclear material processing in Iran. And as I said, all those facilities that Iran would need to build and run, about 7 of them in a row that need to process uranium in order to have highly enriched uranium for a weapon. And so the real question is, can you get rid of all of the traces of nuclear material within 24 days? And our Department of Energy has taken a very close look at this, as have others internationally, and determined that there's just no way. So the 24-day thing is an incredibly strong piece of the transparency puzzle because it allows us confidence that Iran is not going to be able to get away with hiding evidence of nuclear work in an expeditious fashion. So I know I've kind of gone on and on here. I want to make sure that we spend time on your questions. I did want to highlight, though, one other thing, which is that, I've talked about the fissile material side and about how we focused a lot of the efforts on the deal on preventing the acquisition of highly enriched uranium or plutonium. But we also secured from Iran a commitment to never pursue nuclear weapons, and not just in the abstract sense. Iran wanted us to simply note that there was a fatwa against nuclear weapons production, and clearly we said, really not good enough. So what we were able to do in the agreement was get them to commit indefinitely not to undertake certain of those very specific activities that are required to actually make a bomb. So things like making a high explosive system that'll work for a nuclear weapon, or a neutron initiator, or working on computer modeling for a nuclear weapon. Certainly those things are very specific that have no other use. They're committed to not do that for an indefinite period. Beyond that, we were also able to secure something that hasn't gotten a lot of press, but probably should, which is in order to have uranium metal to put into a bomb, you need to be able to make the metal, and that's not an easy task. And Iran has agreed for 15 years that it's not going to try to learn. So we have secured on a wide range of fronts the technical prohibitions that prevent Iran from having the physical capability to make a nuclear weapon without breaking the terms of the deal or without getting caught. And what did we offer in return? Well, a lot has been made about the sanctions relief, that we shouldn't be providing money to the Iranians. But the bottom line is this was the leverage that we were always intending to use to get all of the good things that I just described on the nuclear program. A lot has been said about the amount of money that's going to be going back to the Iranians. There have been statements in the press this amount is $150 billion. It's not true. The total amount of money that Iran is going to have accessible to bring back into country to do something with is just over $50 billion. It is still a tremendous amount of money. But when you think about the context of how far in the hole their economy is, our projection is it's something like $500 billion in the hole. And so they are desperate to try and get their economy revived, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in the workforce enough that Rouhani, who campaigned on a position of getting the economy out of the hole, can actually show that the nuclear program has delivered that. That's why they came to the table, because the sanctions that President Obama, Congress, and our partners were able to effectively implement against the Iranians for the last 5 years and before, they came to the table because they needed to get that sanctions relief. And so for the critics who say, well, this nuclear stuff is great, but you shouldn't give them any money, it's just not practical. It would be, I can't even think of a good analogy, but it would be like going and asking for a car and just not buying it, not giving any money in return. And so an obvious question that flows from that is, well, what are they going to do with the money? And as I said, the most logical thing for them to do is reinvest in the economy, and it's the thing that Rouhani specifically will stand the most to benefit from. We cannot preclude the possibility that some of that money will go to help Iran's malign activities in the region, to support Iran's terrorist proxies. That is a consistent threat. But I have to say that Iran has been projecting force in the region pretty well already, and has been during the course of the sanctions regime. And the hardliners in Iran that are doing these activities are the ones that dislike the deal the most. So when we think about what Iran is getting in return, we have to think about, practically speaking, where the money is likely to go, and the fact that we couldn't both have all of those great restrictions and increased transparency and still keep them and keep their money locked up, as it were. Let me stop there. I'm sure that I missed a few things, but let me turn it back over to Matt to kind of wrap this up before we take your questions.
Thanks, Paul. So let me just speak briefly about sort of where we're at in terms of the process since the deal was announced on July 14th. So since it was announced, as I said at the beginning, we've been engaged in this sustained effort to inform people, inform members of Congress and the public about the terms of the deal. We have worked hard to build validator support, and since the deal was announced, there's been a succession of statements and letters from prominent nuclear scientists, former military officials, former members of Congress, Republican and Democrat alike, Jewish former members of Congress, leaders in the Jewish community, 440 rabbis, faith leaders, former national security officials, Iranian civil society folks, Iranian human rights advocates. So there's been a broad, and on these, with respect to Israel, very importantly, Israeli security experts who have come out and in support of the deal, notwithstanding the fact, obviously, that the Prime Minister of Israel is opposed to the deal. So these validators have come out one after another, and has been important in reinforcing that the deal itself stands on its own legs. And one thing that has been very clear is since the deal came out, no one has really been able to identify any significant or fatal flaw in the deal. There's been a succession of issues that have been raised, in the weeks since the deal. First, it was the 24 days. Then it was, I don't know if I have this in exactly the right order, but then it was, they're getting $150 billion in sanctions relief. Then it was the existence of secret side deals. Then it was Iran is doing its own inspections. Then it was no Americans or Israelis are going to be on the inspection team. Then it was 15 years. After 15 years, they're going to be able to build a nuclear bomb. And each and every one of those contentions, we have forcefully and effectively responded to it. Moreover, we have responded to the questions from the members of Congress who have to make a decision. And we have held over 500 congressional engagements over the course of the weeks since the deal was announced. And many of them involve the president. I mean, the president spent 3.5 hours one night with a group of members from the House of Representatives talking to them about the deal. I think one of the best illustrations of the degree to which we're committed to talking about the facts of this deal was a couple days after it was announced, right? The deal was announced. Immediately, on a partisan basis, many Republicans come out against the deal. They haven't even read the deal. And then, the president holds a press conference where he wants people to ask him from the press about the facts of the deal. They don't have questions, so he starts asking himself questions at the end of the press conference because he so wants to engage in the facts with proponents and opponents of the deal alike. That's not to say that there aren't sincere people who oppose the deal in good faith and have sincere concerns about Israel's security or the regional issues. But, we understand and appreciate those concerns, and we are listening to those concerns and responding to them, and we can talk about that during the question and answer period. But, the reason we got to where we are today was because of the fact that the deal is a good deal. It stands on its own legs. We have effectively responded to the criticisms and the questions, and that, after intensive questioning by members of Congress who, came and spent hours in the White House looking over materials or spent hours in briefings, came to the conclusion after their own review that this is a good deal. And that's why we're in the position that we are in today with positive momentum, but still quite a bit more work to do. So with that, I will stop, and we really look forward to your questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks to the members of the audience for some very good questions. I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and just ask one of my own. And I'm not, given the numbers Matt talked about at the beginning, I'm not sure if this is realistic, but if the deal were to be rejected, my question is, what would be the alternatives? There have been a number of things proposed, negotiating a different deal to make up for some of the deficiencies that are pointed out, continued sanctions. We've heard about, secondary sanctions against other countries that would start to trade with Iran, or, as the president says, a military solution. So I wonder if you might talk about, and I assume that the administration's position, if the deal were rejected, that we still need to do all we can to stop Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. So what alternatives are there out there?
Let me start. There are not good alternatives right now. There are not good diplomatic alternatives if the deal is rejected. I mean, to put it bluntly, we led this coalition. We formed the basis of the sanctions regime, the U.S. government, the administration, and Congress jointly. We were integral to the negotiations. We held together partners from across the world at a time when we had individual problems with those countries. So through the negotiations, we stood shoulder to shoulder with a Russia that had just taken action in Crimea, with China that was hacking us, with other problems that we had consistently, and still we were all united and largely under American leadership. I can't fathom a situation where Secretary Kerry, having agreed to the deal with the full support of the president, would be able to go back to our partners and say, well, okay, we thought we had a deal, we all agreed to this, but we have to go back to the table now, and we're not really sure what's going to be a good enough deal. We're going to have to just keep going until something happens and Congress says it's good enough not to have another vote of disapproval. It's just not realistic. Our credibility as a government, frankly as a country, will be severely undermined if this Secretary of State cannot go and represent the country on matters of extraordinary national security such as this one. As I think he said, there can't be 535 Secretaries of State, which isn't to say that Congress doesn't have an important role, but we have to understand that the way that we were able to get this deal is that we were able to convince our partners before negotiations that we were on the correct path, and at the end of the day, sanctions would be relieved on Iran. This was the pact that we made with them, provided we got what we needed out of the nuclear deal. And because we all agreed in the P5+1 in the European Union as to what the basic parameters of that deal was, when those parameters were met, if we now walk away, we will suffer incredibly for our credibility. And so I don't think it's realistic to go back and get a quote-unquote better deal. The other thing I would point out is that for the critics who say, well, just get a better deal, it's of one of two flavors. It's either so ambiguous as to be inherently unhelpful, just a better deal, or it is so extreme as to be unachievable. So it's not just, look, 5,000 centrifuges is a good number, but we really need 2,000. It's, you can have no enrichment, no centrifuges, you have to give up everything you've built, and in some cases our critics have gone further and demanded things that aren't even part of the nuclear program. And all of this is what is required in order to get a quote-unquote good deal. And so if we were to lose this opportunity to really bring this home, I don't see a diplomatic path that's very viable. The other thing I would say is that our critics have suggested that it's okay because what we can do is we can unilaterally enforce sanctions. It's not going to work. The reason that Iran's economy was under so much pressure is that we were unified as an international community in making sure that countries didn't buy Iranian oil, right? That we were, and countries took an immense hit on this. China, Japan, Turkey, they all signed up because of our leadership to deny Iran revenue in purchasing oil and in doing business with them. We're talking tens of billions of dollars that these countries forfeited, both because of their own interest in preventing Iran from developing nuclear weapons, but also because we asked them to. So now that we have achieved the objective we all agreed to, if we now go to them and say, okay, so we need you to not just do what you did before, but we need further sanctions because that's the only way we're going to get a result. It's just not practical. And the last thing I'd say is that, people who talk about just applying sanctions pressure say, look, it was working. Their economy was on the ropes. You just need to go a little bit further. There's nobody out there, pro or con agreement, that says that the sanctions which we held together are fated to stay where they are, that the sanctity, that the effectiveness of those sanctions is going to remain. Everybody agrees that the effectiveness is going to come down as countries are not going to be as willing to enforce them, and they're going to get leakier. So then here's the conundrum. How do you get a better deal with less leverage? Right? It's not probable, I'll say nicely. It's just not realistic. So what that leaves us is the very strong likelihood that if Congress votes to disapprove and the president vetoes and the Congress overrides the veto, we're going to be in a very difficult position diplomatically, and not just on this issue, but on leadership on a number of issues globally, because people won't know if they can trust us to follow through on our commitments. Beyond that, Iran's program will probably advance. That reactor will continue. That breakout timeline is going to come down from 2 to 3 months to something lower. And all the things that happened when negotiations for the last 12 years fell apart, as I said they did several times, is very likely going to happen again, and that's only going to drive Iran closer to a nuclear threshold. And instead of that, we have the opportunity to strike this deal and have assurances for the 4 pathways for the next 15 years and beyond. Let me stop there if you have.
Right, and so under that scenario, what's left? Then, the president has made very clear that he is committed to preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, which is why he's talked, as a matter of fact, that under this scenario, what's left is a military option, which, he's never taken that off the table, does not achieve what this deal achieves. It creates a situation where breakout time is set back temporarily, and of course, all the while, Iran is enriching, Iran is advancing its program, whereas under this deal, that's put to a stop.
And sorry for the continued tag team, but the end result after that, right, is then if we do want to try and pursue a military option, we've lost legitimacy, right, with partners that we would try to attempt to get as part of a coalition to go after Iran, because then it's not Iran that has violated the agreement, it's us. So then we're in a bad position because we would either have to do it unilaterally or with a lot of twisting of arms, because they would be the ones that were willing to commit to the deal and we're the ones that didn't abide by it.
Great, thank you. Okay, let me get through as many questions from the audience as I can. First, what are the penalties for a breach of this agreement? Will sanctions be gradually lifted on Iran as Iran proves compliance?
Thank you. So one of the things I didn't focus on as much was the sanctions side of this. That's because I'm a nuclear nerd. I was part of the technical side of this. But let me answer the questions. We negotiated something that's unprecedented at the UN Security Council. We have unilateral snapback. And what that means is that if Iran violates any aspect of this deal, if we believe unilaterally that they violate any aspect of this deal, we can snap back all the sanctions that are currently in place on Iran for the next 10 years. We can do the same thing unilaterally whenever we want, right? So the provision of enforcement here is the ability to unilaterally get right back to where we were. And in this particular case, if they did violate the terms of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, we do think that we would be able to muster support for sanctions for at least what we had before and possibly more, because contrary to the previous case where we were the ones walking away, it was Iran that was violating the deal. And so the consequence ultimately for a violation of the deal is sanctions snapback and all of the pain to the economy that comes with it. Now, some people have said, well, surely a minor violation, you're not going to snap back the sanctions. And if that's not the case, then how can people have confidence that it's really enforceable? And the answer is that we're going to try to work with the Iranians on minor violations, and we'll have a calibrated set of actions that doesn't go all the way back to snap back right away, because we expect with such a complicated and intricate deal as this one there are going to be screw-ups. And there could also be actual Iranian attempts to push the limits, to go over the line, to see how far away they can get with it. That isn't necessarily in every case going to be in our interest to blow up the deal. But if we see a major violation, if we see something that is really against the spirit of the agreement, this administration will not hesitate to snap back sanctions. And I have no doubt that subsequent administrations will feel likewise. What we did was we negotiated maximum leverage and maximum flexibility. And because we have the ability to snap back things in a big way, it also allows us to work with our partners to get lesser punishments on the Iranians for fear, from their standpoint, that all the sanctions are going to snap back.
Great, thank you. There's a series of questions about possible Iranian cheating. Let me take one specific one, which you mentioned before. There's been a lot of talk about self-inspections by the Iranians without on-site inspectors, at least some of the facilities, without the presence of international teams. Is this true or false?
Thank you. And I realize I didn't answer the second half of the first question. The question is when the sanctions, when are they pulled back? Sanctions will be suspended when Iran takes all of its nuclear steps. So all the stuff that I said Iran has to do, pulling out centrifuges, filling up the middle of that reactor with concrete, allowing the IAEA all the enhanced monitoring mechanisms, all that has to happen before Iran gets sanctions relief. And so all of those steps will take place on implementation day, which is some point in the future, essentially whenever Iran can get its act together enough to do all the things. We anticipate that'll be at least months after Iran starts doing the preparatory work. Only at that point will they get sanctions suspended, and then sanctions won't be terminated until many years after. In response to the question, this is another one of those things that has taken on a life of its own. Iran doesn't get to do self-inspections. Doesn't get to do it. The IAEA is responsible for inspecting Iran. The IAEA is going to be inspecting Iran's declared facilities, which it knows about today, and any facilities that Iran builds in the future that are consistent with the JCPOA. The IAEA will do there what it does with every other country in the world, except it'll have more access and better technology than anywhere else in the world because we negotiated that too. So for instance, Iran currently will allow the IAEA for the next 15 years daily access to the two enrichment facilities, Natanz and Fordow. The IAEA will be able to use cutting-edge technologies to increase the efficiency of their operations. They'll be able to use a system that was developed by our national laboratories to monitor the enrichment level as centrifuges are doing their thing and enriching to make sure that it doesn't go higher than the levels that were agreed to in the JCPOA. When it comes to suspect sites, the IAEA will be able to go and inspect sites that we or other countries raise questions about, or the IAEA has concerns about, just like they would anywhere else. There's one location that has come under a lot of question, and this is the Parchin facility. And the allegation has been made that Iran there too is going to do self-inspection. So let me talk about that for a second, but I wanted to clear up that the transparency and the verification parts of this deal are rock solid and are really unprecedented arrangements between the IAEA and any other country in the world. When it comes to the Parchin site, the history in Parchin is a large military base. There's an allegation that about a decade ago, actually 12 years ago, Iran used a small portion of that facility, a single building, to conduct an experiment related to a nuclear weapons program. And as I told you at the beginning, Iran has done bad things, both in terms of not declaring things that it's now declared, but also actively researching nuclear weapons. And the U.S. has come to the conclusion, this was in a declassified national intelligence estimate, that Iran had a program to develop nuclear weapons technologies prior to 2003, and then they halted it. This facility is alleged to be part of that effort. And so the IAEA has been trying to get to that facility for the last almost 4 years after it told the Iranians that it was aware of it and it wanted to go. The IAEA has reportedly been trying to sanitize the facility so that if the IAEA comes, it won't find anything. We don't expect Iran or the IAEA to be able to find much if it goes to the site because of the sanitization efforts and because we think that it was involved in weapons work 12 years ago. So the answer to the question is that there is an agreement that has been reached between Iran and the IAEA that dictates precisely who goes, how they go, and how environmental samples that will be able to detect uranium are acquired at the site. Because that's a confidential agreement between Iran and the IAEA, usually member states, other parties to the IAEA, don't get to know. Because of the importance of this particular agreement, several members of the negotiating team, myself included, were briefed on the matter by the IAEA, so we know how they're planning on doing the inspections at this one site. We have briefed everything the IAEA has told us to members of Congress in classified settings, and the problem is that we can't combat a lot of what is being said publicly because we're maintaining the confidentiality of the IAEA process. And so I can't go into details, but I can say that it is not it's not true that Iran is going to inspect itself.
Okay. Generally, explain why you have faith that the Iranians will not cheat on the deal, and then more specifically, with $100 to $150 billion, can't Iran just buy nuclear warheads from North Korea or Russia?
Okay, so the first question is, we don't have faith. As I said, it's distrust and verify. And I'm not being flip. We've watched Iran cheat and lie for more than a decade, and that's why we want the agreement, right? So we have more of an insight into what they're doing and much greater ability through the IAEA to monitor suspect sites, to get access to places, to really try and figure out whether there are nuclear weapons aspirations and whether they're acting on those aspirations today, but also for the next 15, 20, 25 years and beyond. One of the things that people talk about is that this deal is too short. But when you really look at the details, there are only a few provisions that end 10 or 15 years. A lot of the rest of this deal goes on forever. The Iranian commitment to never make a nuclear weapon goes on forever. The additional protocol and all the provisions and all the things that the IAEA now gets to do goes on forever. The commitment not to undertake certain specific weapons activities goes on forever. The conversion of the Iraq reactor to no longer produce weapons-grade plutonium goes on forever. So there are a number of things that go on, but one of the things that we've been focused on from the very start was developing a new baseline to make sure that we're not looking to trust the Iranians, but that the ability of the IAEA at base to do transparency and verification activities is much better than what it is today. That's the first question. We're not trusting the Iranians. Second question is, as I mentioned, the number $100 or $150 billion has been floated out there. It's not the actual number. At one point, to be very blunt, the administration was saying $100 billion because we hadn't taken into account some of the amounts of money that Iran has already committed to other places and isn't readily accessible to come back. So $50 billion is about the amount. And as I said, it's a large sum, but when you look at what Iran has to do with that $50 billion, it's not nearly enough for what are their most pressing needs. With $50 billion, I don't know how much a nuclear weapon from North Korea costs. Hopefully we'll never find out. I'm not going to sit here and say that it's an impossibility. I will say that it would fly in the face of logic in the sense that Iran negotiates a deal after maintaining consistently that it was wrongfully accused, that it wants to be no longer a pariah, that it wants to be part of the international system. If then it got caught buying a nuclear weapon from North Korea, who it would have to trust, by the way, to keep that quiet, it would kind of put a damper on the story. So, I can't preclude that as a possibility. What I can say is that I have no reason to believe that's a practical result. When it comes to buying a nuclear weapon from Russia, remember, Russia was actually a very good partner in these negotiations. We have great disagreements with the government of Russia on a wide range of issues. But on this particular issue, our interests align. We don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon, and we don't want an unnecessary war in the Middle East. The fastest way for that to happen is if Russia were to provide a nuclear weapon to Iran, and of course then we'd have a problem with Russia as well. So let me stop there, and Matt.
Right. No, I just wanted to add the point on this issue of why won't Iran cheat. I mean, another instructive data point, right, is that the interim agreement that was entered into in December 2008 2013 was in place, or has been in place, and it's been verified repeatedly that Iran has abided by the terms of the interim agreement. When critics of the current deal and critics back then of the interim agreement said, oh, they'll never abide by it, but they have abided by it because it's in their interest to do so in order to obtain the sanctions relief that is so important to them and that they desire. And go ahead.
So
Next question.
it's
Yeah.
the sanctions relief, but also the reintegration into the international community. Because often we get the question, what happens? Okay, they're going to get their money back, and then they're just going to cheat. And the answer is that getting $50 billion back doesn't solve their problem. Their inherent problem is that no one will trade with them, they don't have foreign direct investment, and they have such a systemic problem in their economy that simply getting $50 billion, even though it's a lot of money, doesn't inherently fix their problem. And so the threat that they will once again become a pariah state is real for them, and it manifests itself, we hope, in compliance with the JCPOA for the next 15, 20, 25 years.
Right. Oh, and the other thing I was going to say is, it's important to emphasize that Iran is getting sanctions relief. In other words, it's getting assets that are its assets unfrozen and returned to it. But we're not giving up anything in exchange for that. We're not reducing our military assets in the region. We're not reducing our intelligence assets in the region. All the things that we've been doing to ensure regional security, the security of our allies, and our own national security that we have been doing, we will continue to do going forward.
And I apologize for the tag team last comment. Yeah, when people talk about the money that Iran is getting back, let's remember this isn't U.S. taxpayer dollars, right? This money is money that we were able to convince other countries to hold back on Iranian oil payments, right? So countries bought Iranian oil, and then instead of the money going to Iran, it sits in foreign banks, and countries are not releasing the money back to Iran. So this is a deal that we were able to get without spending any money, right? And entirely with getting Iran to concede on a wide variety of nuclear fronts. Now, I don't want to minimize my travel expenses or those of the negotiating team. We did spend a little money. But in the grand context of things, it's not like we're paying for them to take these steps. It's their own money.
There's not going to be a box on your tax return that says, would you like $1 to go to Iranian sanctions relief?
Great, thank you. There's a couple of questions about the kind of consequences of the deal for the Iranian side and engagement with Iran. So one is the Iranian public well and accurately informed about the deal? And then a second, please comment on additional avenues for diplomacy and engagement with Iran beyond the nuclear issue. What, when, pros and cons?
The first question, I don't think I've heard before. It's a very good question, and I don't have a good answer because, frankly, I don't know how well the Iranian regime is really portraying the ins and outs of the deal. Clearly, they're claiming victory. I have a good friend who follows Iran very closely at the State Department. And he told me a long time ago when we were in one of the, I think we were in Oman or something, and he said, look, you have to understand, the Iranians are going to win no matter what. If they come out and they get the better part of the deal, they're victors. If they come out and there's no deal, then they've resisted the West and they're victors. And this mindset that they always have to win, the U.S. is the great state and always has to lose, has become so pervasive that in many ways the details, from what I understand, don't always matter. And so I think, without speaking too much about what the masses on the street understand, what I think is that they recognize they're getting sanctions relief. They recognize that they're taking a hit on their nuclear program. And I think that what apparently is mattering to them, at a broad public basis, is that they're not going to be treated as a pariah. I think a lot of the Iranian public wants reintegration into the system. Now, that's different than the leadership. And it goes to your second question, which is, do we ultimately expect this to change the relationship? And we're very clear-eyed on this. No is the short answer. We hope that down the road, our policies on other aspects of Iran's bad actions in the region, its abysmal human rights efforts, the concerns that we have about its missile program. We hope that our policies will similarly bear fruit on those areas. But to be very clear on this point, it wasn't as if we went into this deal to do a rapprochement with the Iranians. This was about hard-nosed technical realities and the nuclear program that had advanced to the point that we were either going to have to deal with it diplomatically or risk a military option that nobody wanted. And so while we're hopeful that the internal domestic politics inside of Iran, which I don't pretend to understand, will yield more moderates, because Rouhani has been successful in delivering on sanctions relief, we by no means, as the administration, are banking on it, are choosing the next issue that we're going to negotiate with them and working through to some sort of a great meeting of the minds. They're very clear that they still view the West and the United States in particular with great enmity. I don't expect that to change in the near term, and we're not banking on it.
Right. I mean, there's there are certainly those in the Iranian public who've been supportive of the deal. There's a letter, I was just looking it up here, from Iranian civil society activists, intellectuals, journalists, lawyers, university professors, religion investigators, senior members of political parties, calling on the American people to support the deal. So Iranian human rights activists, civil society folks are supportive of the deal. It's the it's the right in the Iranian right that's opposed to it, the Revolutionary Guard. So that's indicative of diversity of views of Iranian opinion. Paul is right, of course, that the regime and the people are not one and the same.
Great. Maybe a last question, which is, excuse me, something that has been discussed in Michigan. The questioner says, although I support the spirit of the agreement and its overall benefits, isn't it painfully tarnished as long as Iran holds Americans, including former Marine Hekmati, from Michigan in detention? I understand the argument for keeping hostage negotiations separate from the agreement. However, it remains tragic that sanctions will lift while Americans remain imprisoned.
Well, let me answer that first. At every meeting that we had on the nuclear deal, the Undersecretary of State or the Secretary of State himself raised the issue of Americans detained in Iran. We've never lost sight of that. And as I think the questioner noted, we couldn't fathom putting that into the mix because we didn't want to have their lives, their freedom bargained for. We didn't want that to be a chip in the negotiations. We didn't want to join the two. With regard to our continued efforts to try and free Americans who are detained in Iran, that is nonstop. I mean, that is a commitment that this administration has continued to uphold and is pursuing at every level that we can at all times. We hope for the immediate release of those individuals. The question about why sanctions relief while those individuals are still held comes down to, why sanctions relief when we still have concerns about the ballistic missile program, or why sanctions relief when there's still terrorism, or why sanctions relief when Iran is doing a number of other things that are against our interests in the region or Israel. And the answer is that our support for the sanctions is embedded in the compact that we made with our partners, which is, look, Iran has to answer for its nuclear sins, if you will, that we have to resolve the nuclear program, and we're going to do that through nuclear-related sanctions. And so the quid pro quo here has always been nuclear for nuclear. And while we very much would like to address the other areas, the President's determined view was that we very much wanted to take care of the nuclear threat first, because an Iran with a nuclear weapon, or more on the cusp of a nuclear weapons ability than it is even today, makes harder all of those other problems. And so, the sanctions lifting was what was required to get at the nuclear steps that we need. It was also what was put in place to get those things. So it's not as if we just sanctioned Iran and then, are lifting, are lifting sanctions only for nuclear. Our terrorism-related sanctions remain in place. The overall embargo against, U.S. businesses interacting with Iranian businesses stays in place, and a number of other efforts that we have to go after and influence Iranian efforts on a wide variety of fronts stay in place. But we were focused on nuclear, and that's why the nuclear sanctions have come off.
And I know we're about to wrap, and I just wanted to mention, you've heard tonight about a lot of different issues. There's a tremendous amount of detail around this agreement. And, we have done our best, as I, said, in order to get the facts out, to make a lot of information available. So we have a Twitter page at the Iran deal where we're posting all kinds of information and developments. For instance, Secretary Moniz, who played a critical role in these negotiations, the energy secretary and one of the world's leading physicists, who ensured that all of the elements of the agreement from a policy standpoint were also supported by science. He's recorded a 4.5-minute video. Information about new letters or statements or members of Congress who are coming out in support of the deal. All of this information is tracked on at the Iran deal. In addition, we have whitehouse.gov/Iran deal or wh.gov/Iran deal, where we have a raft of information. We have graphics. I think today we posted a map that you can scroll over and see what different countries around the world have said about the agreement and where they stand, overwhelmingly in support of the agreement. We have posted online the entire recess package that was provided to members of Congress, which all the information about the deal. On Medium.com, you can also see the deal itself with annotations by Secretary Kerry, Secretary Moniz, and Secretary Liu, highlighting each of the different key provisions in the deal. So there's a lot of information. We really encourage you to dig in if you have questions or you have concerns or you hear things that sound problematic. You need to check the facts. You need to check the materials that we are putting out to ensure that the facts around the deal are getting out and that we are immediately pushing back on any misinformation or red herrings that are put out there.
Well, I hope you'll join me in thanking our two speakers for a really wonderful presentation. And thank you for coming.